On September 16th, 1408, in a small stone church perched on the edge of the world, a Viking wedding took place. The bride wore her finest wool dress, dyed with precious colours that had travelled thousands of miles from Norway across some of the most dangerous waters on earth. The groom stood tall in his best tunic, perhaps inherited from his father or grandfather, woven with patterns that connected him to ancestors he had never met but whose blood ran in his veins. The ceremony followed Christian traditions that their great-grandfathers would barely recognise, conducted in a building that represented everything the old Vikings had once pillaged and burned. Latin words echoed off stone walls in a language few present fully understood, spoken by a priest whose own ordination was questionable. So far removed was this community from the broader Christian world. This wedding at Volsey Church in Greenland would be the last recorded event of the Norse settlements. After this celebration of love and hope for the future, the historical record goes silent. No more births carefully noted in church records. No more deaths mourned with proper Christian burial. No more marriages celebrated with feasting and song. Just silence, stretching across centuries. Within a single generation, an entire civilization would vanish so completely that when European explorers returned 300 years later, they found only crumbling stone ruins and Inuit communities who had vague memories of people who might have been Norse, or might have been legend, or might have been both. The mystery of what happened to these last Vikings has puzzled historians for 600 years. Tonight, we follow their story from the height of Viking power to their final disappearance, tracing one of history's most haunting transformations. This is not the tale of raiders and pillagers that most people know. This is something far more complex and tragic. A story that begins with the end of an age and concludes with the most mysterious disappearance in medieval history. The Vikings didn't just fade away into legend. Something happened to them. Something that transformed them from the terror of Europe into ghosts of history. Their fate holds lessons about human adaptation, the fragility of civilization, and the mysterious ways that entire cultures can simply vanish from the world. The end of the Viking Age. The transformation of the Vikings begins not with their disappearance, but with their success. By the year 1000, the descendants of the fierce raiders who had terrorized Europe for 2 centuries were becoming something their ancestors would have found unrecognizable. They were becoming civilized. When raiders became kings. The year 1066 marks more than just the Norman conquest of England. At Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king, died leading a traditional Viking raid that had become an anachronism in a world that no longer had room for such ventures. His death symbolised the end of an era that had already been dying for generations. The Vikings' disappearance begins not with their physical vanishing, but with their cultural metamorphosis. Across Scandinavia, the decentralised warrior societies that had produced generations of raiders were consolidating into unified kingdoms that looked increasingly like the rest of medieval Europe. The social conditions that had created the Viking Age were systematically being destroyed by the Vikings' own success. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth wasn't just converting to Christianity when he erected the great runic stone at Jelling, declaring that he had made the Danes Christian. He was creating a centralised state that had no use for independent raiders and their chaotic loyalty structures. The stone itself tells the story, carved with images that blend Christian crosses with traditional Norse art. Representing a culture in transition from one worldview to another, the change was profound and irreversible. Young men who once might have joined raiding expeditions now served in royal armies with standardised equipment and disciplined tactics. Jarls who had once led independent warbands now answered to kings who could strip them of their lands for disobedience. The egalitarian warrior culture that had defined Viking society was being replaced by rigid hierarchies that mirrored the feudal systems of the rest of Europe. This transformation wasn't imposed from outside. It was driven by practical necessity. As European defences improved and opportunities for profitable raiding diminished, the old Viking social structure became economically unsustainable. Communities that had once lived by raiding needed new sources of wealth and stability. Centralised kingdoms offered both, but at the cost of the independence and cultural distinctiveness that had made Vikings unique. The Christian Revolution, perhaps no change was more profound than the conversion to Christianity. This wasn't simply a matter of changing gods or adopting new rituals. It was a complete restructuring of worldview, social organisation, and individual identity that touched every aspect of life from birth to death. The Old Norse religion had glorified individual achievement in battle, promising eternal feasting in Valhalla for those who died with weapons in their hands. It celebrated cunning, strength, and the ability to take what you wanted from a hostile world. The gods themselves were warriors, tricksters, and survivors who embodied the harsh realities of life in a dangerous universe. Christianity preached humility, obedience to authority, and salvation through faith rather than deeds. It promised that the meek would inherit the earth, and that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. These were not just different beliefs. They were fundamentally different ways of understanding what it meant to be human and how one should live. The transformation took centuries and was never complete. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia shows the mixing of Christian and pagan symbols well into the 12th century. Thor's hammers were carved alongside Christian crosses. Pagan burial practices continued in Christian graveyards. Families were literally divided between old and new faiths, as shown by the story of Eric the Red, who remained stubbornly pagan while his wife Theodhild converted and built Greenland's first church. But gradually, inexorably, the old ways were abandoned. By 1100, the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden looked remarkably similar to the rest of Christian Europe. They had kings crowned by bishops, stone churches replacing wooden temples, and legal systems based on written law rather than oral tradition and personal honour. The external trappings of Viking culture remained, but the spiritual and social foundations had been completely transformed. The economic revolution, the end of raiding, meant the end of a particular economic system that had sustained Viking society for generations. Viking wealth had traditionally come from three sources raiding for immediate plunder: trading in exotic goods obtained through long-distance expeditions, and tribute extraction from communities too weak to resist but too valuable to destroy. As centralized kingdoms emerged across Europe and defensive technologies improved, raiding became increasingly unprofitable and dangerous. The easy targets were gone, replaced by well-fortified cities defended by professional armies rather than hastily assembled militias. The monastery raids that had made Vikings wealthy in the 9th century were no longer possible against the stone fortifications and military orders of the 11th century. Trade routes were changing too. The eastern routes down the Volga River that had made Swedish Vikings wealthy by connecting Scandinavia to Constantinople and the Islamic world were being disrupted by political changes in the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the new powers in Eastern Europe. The old network of trading posts and diplomatic relationships that had sustained this commerce for centuries was fragmenting. Most importantly, the introduction of silver currency and Christian economic ethics transformed how Scandinavians thought about wealth itself. The old Viking ethos of redistribution through gift-giving and feasting, where wealth was a tool for building loyalty and reputation rather than an end in itself, was replaced by concepts of individual ownership and capital accumulation that aligned with medieval European norms. This economic transformation was both cause and effect of the broader cultural changes, as raiding became less profitable. Viking communities needed new sources of stability and wealth, but adapting to new economic systems required abandoning the social structures and cultural values that had made the Vikings distinctive. Success in the New World meant ceasing to be Viking in any meaningful sense. By 1100, the transformation was largely complete. The descendants of Vikings had become Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, Christian subjects of Christian kings who happened to live in the lands their ancestors had raided from. The Viking Age was over not because Vikings had been defeated, but because they had evolved into something else entirely. The last Vikings of Greenland, while mainland Scandinavia was transforming into Christian kingdoms, indistinguishable from the rest of medieval Europe. One group of Vikings made a final, desperate attempt to preserve something of the old ways. Their story would become one of the most remarkable episodes of human survival and adaptation in recorded history, ending in a mystery that persists to this day. Eric the Red's gamble in 985, Eric Thorvaldsson, known as Eric the Red for his flame-coloured hair and beard, made a decision that would define the fate of the last Vikings. Exiled from Norway for killing a man, then exiled from Iceland for killing more men, he found himself with nowhere to go in the increasingly civilized and law-governed world of Scandinavia. So he decided to leave that world entirely. Eric had heard rumours of land to the west of Iceland, glimpsed by sailors blown off course during storms. In 982 he set out to find this land, spending 3 years exploring a vast Mosbrugir, mostly empty territory covered in ice and stone. When he returned to Iceland, he brought tales of green valleys, good pasture, and opportunities for anyone brave enough to follow him. The name he chose for this new land was Brilliant Marketing Greenland. The reality was harsher than the name suggested, but Eric understood that desperate people would believe in the possibility of better lives if given even a hint of hope. Iceland was becoming overcrowded, its best land already claimed by earlier settlers. Young families faced a future of poverty and dependence. Well, they could risk everything on Eric's promise of land and independence. In 985, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships filled with everything needed to establish a new society: livestock, tools, weapons, seeds, and approximately 500 people willing to bet their lives on his vision. The North Atlantic had other plans. Storms, ice, and the simple hostility of one of the world's most dangerous sailing routes reduced Eric's fleet to 14 ships by the time they reached Greenland's southwestern coast. But the survivors had accomplished something remarkable. They had established European settlements farther west than anyone had managed before, in one of the most challenging environments humans had ever attempted to colonize permanently. More importantly, from our perspective, they had created what would become the last purely Norse society, isolated from the changes transforming their homeland. Life on the edge of survival. The settlements the survivors established were unlike anything in the Viking world. The western settlement near present-day Nuuk and the larger eastern settlement in the area around Narsarsuaq were not trading ports or military bases, but agricultural communities designed to be self-sufficient in a land that seemed determined to kill anyone foolish enough to try living there. Greenland's climate was marginal for European-style agriculture, even during the medieval warm period when the Norse arrived. The growing season was short, the soil thin and rocky, and the winter storms capable of destroying years of work in a few hours. But these were Vikings, and Vikings had spent centuries making the impossible work through stubbornness, ingenuity, and a willingness to adapt when adaptation meant survival. For nearly 500 years, they succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. At their peak, around 1250, between 2000 and 3000, Norse lived in Greenland settlements, maintaining what was essentially a European society in the Arctic. They built stone churches that still stand today, maintained complex trading relationships with Europe, and developed sophisticated adaptations to Arctic life that allowed them to thrive where other Europeans would have died. Archaeological evidence reveals a society that was anything but primitive or backward. They modified their traditional house designs to conserve heat, connecting living spaces directly to livestock areas to take advantage of animal body heat during the bitter winter months. When wood became scarce, they used whale shoulder blades as room dividers and driftwood from Siberia for construction. They developed new hunting techniques specifically adapted to Arctic conditions, becoming expert seal hunters and walrus killers. Perhaps most remarkably, their diet shifted dramatically over the centuries they lived in Greenland. Analysis of skeletal remains shows that by the 14th century, marine mammals made up fully 80% of their food intake. This wasn't the diet of Europeans stubbornly trying to maintain inappropriate farming practices in an Arctic environment. This was evidence of a people who had successfully adapted their entire way of life to match the resources their harsh homeland provided. This adaptation extended beyond mere survival techniques to complex cultural and social changes. The Greenland Norse developed their own dialect, their own architectural styles, and their own solutions to the challenges of maintaining European Christian culture in isolation from the broader European world. They were simultaneously the most traditional Vikings, preserving customs that were disappearing elsewhere, and the most innovative, constantly developing new ways to survive in conditions no other Europeans had faced. The ivory economy. What made their remarkable survival possible was walrus ivory. In medieval Europe, walrus tusks were literally more valuable than gold. They were carved into elaborate religious artifacts, chess pieces, and decorative objects for the wealthy. The famous Lewis chessmen, discovered in Scotland but probably carved by Norse craftsmen, were likely made from Greenland walrus ivory. This created a unique and profitable economic relationship between Greenland and Europe. The Arctic settlements produced one of Europe's most desired luxury goods, while depending entirely on imports of iron, wood, grain, and other necessities that could not be produced locally. Ships would arrive from Norway carrying essential supplies and European manufactured goods, then return laden with ivory that would make their owners wealthy. The system worked perfectly for 2 centuries. Regular supply ships maintained Greenland's connection to European civilization, while the steady flow of ivory provided the economic justification for maintaining that expensive and dangerous connection. The Norse settlements remained European, Christian, and prosperous despite their isolation at the edge of the known world, but the system was inherently fragile, dependent on continued European demand for walrus ivory, reliable transportation across some of the world's most dangerous waters, and stable political conditions in Norway that made the expensive supply runs profitable. Any disruption to this delicate economic ecosystem could prove catastrophic for communities that had no alternatives. The walrus herds themselves were a limited resource. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 1300 the Norse may have been overhunting their primary economic foundation, travelling farther and farther north to find the large bulls that produced the most valuable ivory. This created a feedback loop where declining walrus populations required more intensive hunting efforts just to maintain the same level of production. The perfect storm begins around 1250. Everything that could go wrong began going wrong at once. The Little Ice Age was beginning, bringing colder temperatures, more sea ice, and shorter growing seasons. The climate that had made Greenland settlement possible was gradually disappearing, replaced by conditions that would challenge even the most adaptable people. But climate change alone doesn't explain what happened to the Greenland Norse. Humans had survived far worse environmental challenges. The Norse had already demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt to harsh conditions. Something else was contributing to their ultimate fate. The first sign of trouble was economic. African elephant ivory began arriving in European markets through expanded Mediterranean trade routes connecting Europe to Africa. Elephant ivory was whiter, more consistent in texture, and easier to carve than walrus ivory with its distinctive mottled patterns. Almost overnight, Greenland's primary export became less desirable and less valuable. This created what modern economists would recognise as a classic resource curse scenario. As ivory prices fell, the Norse had to hunt more walrus to maintain the same income, potentially accelerating the depletion of their most important resource. Meanwhile, the reduced value of their exports made the expensive and dangerous supply runs from Norway less profitable for European merchants. The economic pressure was compounded by political changes in Europe. The unified kingdoms that had emerged from Viking Age chaos were facing their own challenges. Wars, famines, and political instability made long-distance trade ventures seem less attractive than addressing immediate domestic problems. In 1349, the Black Death reached Norway, killing an estimated 40 to 50% of the population. While there's no evidence the plague ever reached Greenland, its indirect effects were devastating for the Arctic settlements. Norway's economy collapsed, its shipping industry was decimated, and maintaining contact with distant colonies became impossible rather than merely expensive. The last recorded ship from Greenland reached Norway in 1410. After that, the historical record falls silent, but archaeological evidence suggests the settlements continued for at least another generation, slowly dying from a combination of factors that individually might have been survivable, but together created an impossible situation. Rising sea levels, caused by ice sheet movement during the Little Ice Age, flooded some of the best coastal farmland. Colder temperatures shortened growing seasons and increased sea ice formation, making both agriculture and navigation more difficult. The social and psychological effects of isolation may have been worst of all. Cut off from Europe, the Greenland Norse were losing their connection to the broader Christian world that had given their lives meaning and purpose. The mystery of disappearance by 1400 archaeological evidence suggests that only the eastern settlement remained inhabited. The western settlement, once home to hundreds of Norse families, had been abandoned sometime in the mid-14th century. Its buildings were left to slowly collapse as Arctic storms battered structures no longer maintained by human hands. The eastern settlement persisted longer, sustained by its larger population and better agricultural land. But it too was clearly in decline. Church records become sporadic, suggesting that religious life, so central to Norse identity, was becoming difficult to maintain without regular contact with European Christianity. The last generation. We can reconstruct something of what those final decades were like through archaeological evidence and the few documentary sources that survive. Families huddled in houses originally designed for larger communities, struggling to maintain Christian rituals without ordained priests. Preserving Norse traditions their children might never have the opportunity to pass on to another generation. The wedding recorded in 1408 represents more than just a celebration of a love between two young people. It was an act of defiance against despair, a declaration that life and hope and the future could continue even as their world crumbled around them. Someone took the trouble to record this wedding in the church records, suggesting that even in their isolation, The Greenland Norse maintained some connection to European customs of documentation and legal formality. But what happened after 1408 remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. Archaeological evidence suggests occupation of some sites continued until approximately 1430, but we have no records of how the end came. Did the last families slowly starve as their food sources failed and their agricultural system finally collapsed? Did they attempt a desperate migration back to Iceland or Norway? Perishing in the North Atlantic during the journey, did some survive by joining Inuit communities? Their Norse identity gradually dissolving into something new and unrecognisable. The archaeological record provides clues but no definitive answers. The ruins show no evidence of violent destruction. There are no burned buildings, no mass graves, no signs of warfare or sudden catastrophe. Instead, the evidence suggests gradual abandonment over a period of years or even decades. Valuable items were left behind in some buildings, suggesting that departures weren't always planned well in advance. But other sites show evidence of systematic removal of useful materials, indicating that some families had time to prepare for relocation. The pattern is consistent with a community under stress, with different families making different decisions about when and how to leave as conditions became increasingly untenable. The archaeological evidence modern excavations have revealed tantalizing details about the final period of Norse occupation. Some human remains show clear signs of malnutrition, evidence that food scarcity was indeed a serious problem in the final decades. But the numbers are far too small to account for the disappearance of an entire population of several thousand people. One of the most intriguing discoveries is the evidence of continued adaptation even in the final period. House designs show modifications for extreme cold weather. Food remains indicate an almost complete reliance on marine resources, suggesting the Norse had essentially abandoned agriculture in favour of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle based on seal hunting. This contradicts older theories that portrayed the Greenland Norse as inflexible conservatives who refused to adapt to changing conditions. The archaeological evidence shows people who continued trying new survival strategies right up until the end. People who were actively fighting for survival rather than passively accepting defeat. The mystery deepens when we consider what's missing from the archaeological record. Very few Norse artifacts have been found in Inuit sites from this period, despite evidence of contact and trade between the two groups. If the Norse had been absorbed into Inuit communities, we would expect to find more evidence of cultural mixing. Similarly, there's little evidence of any successful migration back to Iceland or Europe. Given the harsh conditions in the North Atlantic during the Little Ice Age, it's likely that any attempt to evacuate the entire population would have resulted in massive loss of life that would be remembered in Icelandic or Norwegian historical records. What the Inuit remember, Inuit oral traditions preserve some memories of the Norse, though these accounts must be interpreted carefully given the centuries that have passed since contact ended. The stories describe people they called Tunit, or Savulek, who lived in stone houses and had different customs from the Inuit. Some accounts describe conflicts between Inuit and Norse, usually over resources like hunting grounds or driftwood. Others describe trade relationships and occasional intermarriage. One particularly intriguing story describes a group of people living in houses built partly underground, which could be a reference to late-period Norse architecture adapted for extreme cold. But none of the Inuit stories describe a final battle, a great catastrophe or a dramatic exodus. Instead, they suggest that the Norse simply became fewer and fewer over time until one day they were no longer there. This gradual fading matches the archaeological evidence better than theories of sudden collapse or violent conquest. The Inuit accounts also include some details that seem to reflect genuine memory rather than later invention. Descriptions of Norse clothing, housing styles, and even some Norse words that were incorporated into Inuit vocabulary suggest real cultural contact and some preservation of historical memory. Across centuries, the brutal mathematics of survival. Modern demographic analysis suggests that by 1400, the Greenland Norse had entered what population experts call a demographic trap. Their community had become too small to maintain itself under the harsh conditions they faced. In any challenging environment, a population needs a certain minimum size to survive normal fluctuations in birth rates, death rates, and environmental conditions. Below that threshold, random variations that would be insignificant in a larger population can drive small communities to extinction even without major catastrophes. By the early 15th century, the Greenland Norse had probably fallen below this critical threshold. Even without climate change, economic isolation, or any other external pressures, normal variations in weather, food availability, and human fertility would eventually have driven such a small population to extinction through simple bad luck. The irony is brutal and poignant. The same isolation that had allowed the Greenland Norse to preserve their distinctive culture for 4 centuries had become a death sentence. Connected to the broader European world, they might have survived climate change and economic disruption through immigration, trade, and cultural adaptation. Cut off from outside support, they were doomed by the mathematics of small population survival. Their fate illustrates one of the harsh realities of human settlement in marginal environments. Success in such places requires not just adaptation and survival skills, but also sufficient population size and external connections to buffer against the inevitable bad years that will come. The Greenland Norse had achieved remarkable adaptation, but it wasn't enough to overcome their fundamental vulnerability as an isolated small population. The legend and the reality, the mystery of the Greenland Norse didn't end with their disappearance. For centuries afterward, Europeans wondered what had happened to their fellow Christians in the Arctic, and whether any descendants might still be alive somewhere in Greenland's vast, unexplored interior. The search for survivors in 1721. The Danish-Norwegian missionary Hans Egede sailed to Greenland with the specific goal of finding and reconverting the descendants of the medieval Norse. The plan was based on the assumption that the Greenland colonies had survived but had reverted to paganism during their long isolation from European Christianity. Instead of thriving communities of Norse descendants, Egede found only crumbling stone ruins and Inuit communities who had some vague memories of previous inhabitants but no direct connection to them. The Vikings had vanished so completely that even their buildings were dissolving back into the Arctic landscape. This discovery sparked rather than satisfied European curiosity about the fate of the Greenland Norse. If they hadn't survived in place, where had they gone? Had they migrated to some other part of Greenland? Had they been absorbed into Inuit communities? Their European features gradually disappearing through intermarriage. Had they found some way to return to Europe that had been lost from historical records? These questions generated numerous expeditions and wild theories over the following centuries. Some explorers claimed to have found Norse survivors living as white Eskimos in remote parts of Greenland or Arctic Canada. Others reported discovering Norse artifacts or ruins in places far from the known settlement areas. Most of these claims proved to be based on misidentification, wishful thinking, or deliberate fraud, but they kept alive the hope that the mystery might someday be solved through exploration. Romantic myths and harsh realities, the mystery of the Greenland Norse became a blank canvas for European anxieties and fantasies about civilization, survival, and cultural identity. The stories Europeans told about their fate often revealed more about contemporary concerns than about historical reality. Some accounts imagine noble Vikings maintaining pure Norse culture in hidden valleys somewhere in Greenland's interior, preserving the heroic traditions of their ancestors despite centuries of isolation. These romantic visions appealed to 19th and early 20th century Europeans who were increasingly concerned about the effects of modernization and industrialization on traditional culture. Other stories depicted degenerate survivors who had lost their civilization and become savage, barely distinguishable from the primitive Inuit. These tales reflected contemporary fears about racial mixing and cultural decline, projecting European social anxieties onto the mystery of the disappeared Norse. The truth revealed by modern archaeology is both more mundane and more tragic than either of these extremes. The Greenland Norse weren't destroyed by any single dramatic catastrophe, nor did they survive in some hidden refuge. They were slowly worn down by the accumulation of problems they couldn't solve: climate change, economic isolation, demographic decline, and social dissolution. Their fate represents one of history's most complete cultural disappearances. Unlike other lost civilizations that left massive ruins or were absorbed into successor cultures where traces of their influence can still be detected, the Greenland Norse simply ended. Their language died with its last speakers. Their customs were not passed on to other communities. Their genetic lineage, if it survived at all, was so diluted through intermarriage that it became undetectable. What their story teaches, the fate of the Greenland Norse offers sobering lessons about human adaptation, the limits of resilience, and the factors that determine whether communities survive or disappear when faced with overwhelming challenges. These were not primitive people who failed to adapt to changing conditions. They were sophisticated, flexible, and remarkably successful for nearly 5 centuries. They demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity in developing survival techniques for one of the world's harshest environments. They maintained complex cultural institutions across generations of isolation. They showed remarkable ability to modify their lifestyle and social organisation in response to changing circumstances. Yet none of this was enough to prevent their ultimate disappearance. Their story demonstrates how human communities can be destroyed not by single catastrophic events, but by the convergence of multiple problems that individually might be survivable. Climate change, economic disruption, political isolation, demographic decline. Any one of these challenges might have been overcome through adaptation and resilience. Together, they created what researchers now call a perfect storm that overwhelmed even the most resourceful community. The Greenland Norse also illustrate the double-edged nature of isolation in human societies. Their separation from European political and religious interference allowed them to maintain distinctive cultural traditions far longer than Vikings elsewhere, who were rapidly absorbed into medieval Christian kingdoms. But that same isolation made them vulnerable when conditions changed and they needed outside resources, population, or technical knowledge to survive. Their experience suggests that long-term human survival in challenging environments requires not just local adaptation, but also maintenance of connections to broader networks that can provide support during crisis periods. Complete self-sufficiency, even when achieved through remarkable skill and adaptation, may not be sustainable over the long term when communities face the kind of multiple, simultaneous challenges that characterized the late medieval period. We return now to that September day in 1408 to the wedding celebration that marked the last recorded moment of Norse Greenland. The ceremony at Vulsey Church was more than just the union of two young people. It was the final documented act of a civilization that had persisted for over 4 centuries in one of the most challenging environments humans had ever successfully colonized. After the Christian ceremony, the couple would have celebrated with their community according to customs that blended Norse tradition with Christian practice. They would have feasted on seal meat and dried fish, danced to music, played on instruments their ancestors had brought from Norway, and exchanged gifts that represented both their personal affection and the social bonds that held their small community together. The guests would have included most of the surviving Norse population, perhaps no more than a few dozen families struggling to maintain European civilization at the edge of the habitable world. Children would have played outside the stone church while adults discussed the challenges they faced: failing crops, scarce game, isolation from the European world that gave meaning to their Christian identity. Within 20 years of this celebration, they were all gone. The bride and groom, the priest who married them, the children who played outside the church, the elders who remembered better times, all disappeared into history so completely that we can't even guess what happened to them. Their bones rest in unmarked graves somewhere in Greenland's harsh landscape, if they rest anywhere at all. But perhaps the deepest mystery isn't what specifically happened to the Greenland Norse in their final years. Perhaps it's what their story tells us about the nature of human societies and the fragility of civilization itself. Even at its most adapted and resilient, the Greenland Norse accomplished something remarkable that deserves recognition alongside any achievement in human history. They maintained a European Christian culture in one of the world's most challenging environments for longer than the United States has existed as a nation. They developed sophisticated survival techniques that allowed them to thrive where other Europeans would have died within months. They preserved traditions, maintained institutions, and created communities that worked for nearly 500 years. Yet all of that achievement, all of that struggle and adaptation and gradual success, disappeared so completely that for centuries Europeans forgot the settlements had ever existed. Their ruins crumbled into the landscape. Their language died without being recorded. Their innovations were not passed on to others who might have benefited from their hard-won knowledge. Their story is a reminder that human civilizations, no matter how sophisticated, well-adapted, or successful, exist in constant tension with forces beyond their control: environmental change, economic disruption, political isolation, demographic decline. These are challenges that every human community faces in some form. The difference between survival and disappearance often comes down to timing, luck, and the complex interaction of factors that no society can fully control or predict. The mystery of the Vikings' ultimate fate was never really about raiders and pillagers becoming farmers and merchants in distant kingdoms. It was about what happens when human societies reach the limits of their adaptability, when the perfect storm of circumstances overwhelms even the most resourceful and determined people. Their story echoes in our modern world, reminding us that no civilization however advanced or adaptable, is guaranteed permanence. The challenges facing the Greenland Norse, climate change, resource depletion, economic isolation, social fragmentation are challenges that human communities continue to face today. Though in different forms and contexts, the last Vikings of Greenland achieved something extraordinary and lost it all, leaving behind only ruins, artifacts, and the enduring mystery of what it means to be human in a world that offers no guarantees of survival. No matter how hard we work or how cleverly we adapt to the challenges we face, in the Arctic silence where their settlements once stood, the wind still moves through stone foundations and across ground where their children once played. Somewhere in that vast landscape lie answers to questions we're still asking, buried beneath centuries of snow and time and the endless, patient silence of the North. Their disappearance reminds us that every human community exists on borrowed time, sustained by the complex interaction of environmental, economic, social world, and demographic factors that can shift without warning. The Vikings didn't vanish because they were primitive or inflexible. They vanished because they were human. And being human means being vulnerable to forces larger than ourselves. No matter how clever or determined we might be, the wedding at Volsey Church in 1408 was both an ending and a beginning, the last act of a remarkable civilization, and the starting point for a mystery that continues to challenge our understanding of human resilience and human fragility, in celebrating love and hope for the future even as their world collapsed around them. Those last Vikings left us a reminder that being human means continuing to believe in tomorrow, even when today offers little reason for hope. Their story is not just about what happened to one isolated community 600 years ago. It's about the eternal human struggle to survive and thrive in a world that is indifferent to our hopes and dreams, and about the mysterious ways that even our greatest achievements can vanish into silence, leaving only questions for those who come after us to ponder in the darkness.